In part two of our look at the changing metro order in the post-World War II era, we're going to pick up with our third factor. So far we've discussed suburbanization and federal investments in the Sun Belt. Now we're going to look at deindustrialization. And deindustrialization, as you'll recall, is the removal of the manufacturing and industrial base in our older cities. Now, deindustrialization began in places throughout the Rust Belt, cities like Milwaukee, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Baltimore. Early on, sites of manufacturing moved to the Sun Belt, moved to places in the United States where labor was cheaper, where the cost of production was less. Later on, in the late 1900s, it moved overseas. So we recognize the impacts of deindustrialization and how deindustrialization was much more than just an economic shift. There was a strong personal change that also occurred. When we look at culture, when we look at the sense of place, as jobs were being removed from certain metro areas, lifestyles, sense of place, connection, optimism also left with it. So with deindustrialization, we saw rapid prosperity and decline. So areas that were gaining sites of production were hiring thousands of people. People were gaining jobs. The average wages were increasing. In areas that lost these occupations, rapid decline set in. And one of the key points that Chen makes in this chapter is that capital moves easier than labor. So by the mid to late 1900s, companies were able to reorganize their sites of production, and they were able to move again early on into the Sun Belt and then later on overseas. So it was easier for a company like General Electric or General Motors or Panasonic to set up sites of production in East Asia and ship the goods all the way back than it was to keep paying the prevailing wages in our Rust Belt cities. So when this happens, we see, again, a major reorganization in our metro areas, a physical and economic reorganization followed by a dramatic social reorganization. Here is a map of the Rust Belt. And again, you can see the areas in darker red were those that were really negatively affected by deindustrialization. And the sites of manufacturing, again, extended into places like Allentown, Baltimore, Trenton, southwest towards St. Louis, and then into the western end of Kentucky, southern Indiana. So these areas, again, suffered a dramatic economic decline. They also suffered a brain drain. So the people that were most talented and able to leave would leave when the jobs dried up or left. And what we saw was that people that were older in the workforce, 50s and 60s, were really struggling to reemerge in a new job market. So the prevailing wages that they were earning in manufacturing could not be found elsewhere based on their education and skill set. So we saw, again, an economic decline. We also saw a decline in sense of place. So as the place where these people lived for decades underwent change, experienced a vacuum of investment and jobs leaving, many of these cities went into further decline. Reminder of a graphic I showed earlier of the three cities, Baltimore, Detroit, and Cleveland, and how these cities really reflect this changing metro order in the post-World War II era. Again, notice how all of these cities experienced peak population in the 1950 census. And from there, they all went into population decline. And the population decline is just one figure. In addition to the population decline, you have economic decline, you have a decline in your tax base, a decline in social services. The place becomes a less attractive city to reside. And you'll really notice, again, the drop in population. In Baltimore, it's over 30%. In Cleveland, it's over 60%. And in Detroit, it is also over 60%. These are staggering numbers when we think about clearing out a metro area. Think about if your community today lost even 30% of the people. What would that do to that sense of place? What would that do to your local government's ability to fund important services? So there are human consequences with this. One, again, the manufacturing jobs leave. And in replacement, we have low-paying service jobs. So we have retail jobs, we have restaurant jobs. We don't have those secondary sector activities, those manufacturing jobs that provided stability for middle-class families. The unemployment rate goes up during this time. And again, there is much more than just dollars and cents when we talk about this, right? It's sense of place, it's livelihood. Many of the younger people in the workforce would leave when the manufacturing jobs leave. So you have that brain drain. Your best and your brightest are going elsewhere. Many of the members of the older workforce, again, had to take those low-paying service sector jobs if they weren't ready to retire. Many people just were cut out of the workforce, not intentionally, but they didn't have a match as our economy in these cities were beginning to reorder. Later on, after manufacturing left, we saw a rise in higher paying white collar professional positions. But the employees that were working in the manufacturing sector weren't prepared, weren't a match for those new jobs that came later. So the human consequences were significant. In addition to that, we have political consequences, and you have a reduced tax base. You have fewer businesses paying local taxes. You have fewer people earning an income that could be taxed for local income. So while nobody likes to pay taxes, a healthy economy is vital for local services. As a result, government services were reduced. Some of them were eliminated. We're not talking about wants here, we're talking about needs. We're talking about the need to fund schools. We're talking about the need to pick up trash on a regular basis. We're talking about a need to keep our cities safe through different police and fire services. So again, when you reduce your tax base by 30, 40, 50, in some cases over 60%, that is a reduction in the budget for critical services. So it's not surprising that when you visit cities like Detroit, cities like Baltimore, different cities in the Rust Belt, you see certain communities in particular that have experienced decades of lack of investment. Consider redlining from the early 1900s and how lending was cut off from those communities. Many of those redlined communities were then hit by a reduction in government services. So some of the redlined communities, again, originating in the 1930s, have undergone over 80 years of lack of investment. First through decline as lenders were cut off, then the local jobs and businesses left, which dried up the tax base, which required governments to reduce services. So again, you see how suburbanization, then coupled with deindustrialization and the political consequences, worsened the conditions in certain communities that were already at risk. So we ask ourselves, what's next, right? Now, if you're in those communities, many of these communities, again, have experienced decades of decline. In many of these cities, in order to remain fiscally solvent, have increased property taxes. So the people that have remained are paying a higher property tax. So in order to make their budget work, they're taxing the remaining people that are there, which further reduces the incentive to stay, which creates, in many cases, an additional push factor, where the suburbs with a lower tax rate is a more attractive place. So we see that these cities had to figure out a way to reimagine, reinvent themselves. And we'll look at ways in which they do that later on in this term. But this was a really a crossroads for many cities, where we saw some cities reinvent themselves, adopt the new economy, high tech, working class, professional, service sector jobs, where those that struggled to hold on to the manufacturing base really prolonged their decline. So with deindustrialization, again, what's next? We saw the decline. We saw that the sense of place declined. Staying in the cities that were declining often led to longer term decline. And we saw, again, the rise of the Sun Belt. Many people, not just workers, were going to the Sun Belt. So people that were near retirement or retired in our older industrial cities said, you know what, the winters here aren't great. Our property taxes are increasing, government services are decreasing. Let's go somewhere else. Let's go to the Sun Belt where property is cheaper, where we could spend our retirement in better weather. Uh, Deindustrialization also saw businesses pursue lower cost labor in the Sun Belt, where many of our Northeast and Great Lakes cities had a high union workforce. That wasn't the case in the Sun Belt. And again, defense projects, federal investment contributed to this deindustrialization movement. So deindustrialization was one factor. And then when we throw in federal investment outside of our deindustrialized cities, that further worsened the scenario in our old cities and benefited the Sun Belt. So with this shift, we saw energy, a term used by Clay, and population growth moved. You'll recognize here the shift out of the Northeast and Great Lakes into the Sun Belt and later the West Coast. This is where people were moving. People were moving here for jobs. People were moving here as retirement. People were moving here simply to flee the cities that were deindustrializing and socially, politically, and economically declining. This, again, I'm reiterating a few terms here, that this was a significant change in the American metropolitan order, something that we cannot overstate. Suburbanization, federal investment directed outside of the Northeast into the Sun Belt, and later on deindustrialization, allowed us to reform, recreate, and reimagine the metropolitan order in the United States. As you can see here, the mean center, the population center of the United States, has shifted west, and now it's in Missouri. What this means is that there are an equal number of people in each direction outside of that dot. You'll notice all the way back, 1810, it was in Northwest Virginia. The original census in 1790 put the mean center in Maryland, meaning that in every direction we had an equal number of people. So you can see that pull west. As more and more people move west, the population center of the United States shifts with it. So as our Sun Belt continues to rise and thrive, we're going to see this mean center continue to shift west, probably at a slower pace. Many of our industrial cities have evolved into post-industrial cities. So in the 2020s, we've seen that cities like Boston, cities like Washington, D.C., those cities and metro areas are attracting a lot more people. New York City remains, again, our largest metro area. So we should see some slowing in this westward shift. But the shift between 1910 and 2010 further supports the roles of suburbanization, deindustrialization, and federal investment.